What you are about to see is a documentary expose offering a look at the turbulence between Israel and Palestine from the eyes of innocence. 11 millennials representing 7 countries were brought to Israel and Palestine to get an unfiltered first-hand sense of the actual conflicts and often futile attempts towards peace between 2 continually warring cultures. So join us as we engage the insights of our young truth seekers along with numerous well-respected leaders, historians, and other peacemakers to get the truth from a perspective you may never have seen before. Meet Andrew and Daphne of Generation to Generation, an England and American-based nonprofit who are the visionaries for this endeavor.
And we want to welcome you as you start to watch this documentary, which was born out of a trip we actually made to Israel.
And while we were here, we felt safe, we felt like we were protected. In fact, you wouldn't necessarily even know that there was an operation on during our trip. But when we got back to England, this was the worst part for us. We would see in the news that they would show pictures of Syria, what ISIS had been doing there, and they would say that's what Israel were doing to the Palestinians.
So we had this idea of bringing young people to Israel and letting them discover for themselves what they see here. What do they see on the Palestinian side? And so this is their journey, it's their story, it's their reflections. All we have tried to do is expose them authentically to the Palestinian leaders, to Israeli leaders, to the grassroots people living in these lands. And we hope that you too will be challenged as you follow the story of these amazing young people.
My purpose and vision for coming to Israel this year is to learn more about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict from all the people in the land, and not just by getting one side versus the other.
To really discover from my own perspective what is really going on and not have bias that I find that social media portrays.
I haven't been hearing about good news about Israel through the net and from what my family said, but now I'm here, so I'm here to see the truth.
Having to worry about who's biased, who's not biased, and just know that I can trust the truth and I can go back and say, hey guys, this is the truth. And I know this is the truth because I heard it from these people, not through the media.
The truth about the Jewish culture is really what I really want to experience here.
And I'm here because I want to learn about international affairs, and I believe that they all have to do with the conflict around Israel.
I never hear much positive. A lot of people are like, oh, they're mean, they're cruel. And I want to prove that there's always positive, that there's positive perspective in Israel.
And I'm here in Israel just to understand a little bit more about the conflicts going on here and bring back to my country, and also just to walk in the places that the Bible talks about and to really have this experience myself.
So I wanted to come on this trip to take what I learned about the conflicts and the cultures to bring it back and apply it to my campus and my studies.
Understand the conflict that's going on in this country and take out the positive things out into the world rather than having negative things about Israel.
To get an unfiltered account of what is happening here and hear the stories of the people on both sides.
I understood their struggle. Like a lot of the world sees them like they demonize them because of the terrorism that takes place between the Jews and the Palestinians. But if you look at it from their perspective, is justified.
Your effort as young people, as students, is a plus for us. You will be our ambassadors.
We're now in Bethlehem, and today we're going to meet with the governor, and we're going to meet with an advisor for Christian affairs.
And the Minister of Tourism. But we don't want them just to meet with officials, we want them to meet with the people at grassroots level and to have a compassion for these people.
The visit to Bethlehem on the West Bank began on a promising note as our international delegation took up temporary residence at the beautiful and historical landmark known as Jasir Palace. Our young truth seekers' first task was to interview officials and other dignitaries to garner insights about the Palestinian people and their interactions with Israelis. Among the first interviewees were the governor of Bethlehem and surrounding district, Jibreen al-Bakri, and Palestine's director of Christian affairs, Ziad al-Bandik.
We need to live in peace, we need to trust our future, we need to live in our state. We do not want to live under occupation. They are talking about us that we are dangerous, and we are teaching about our people also in order to make terrorist actions on the ground. And we are teaching our children to go to violence. It's not true.
So in America, the news that talks about the conflicts that go on between Israel and Palestine, it's conflicting in information, the different sides. How do we know what to believe is true and what's not true?
You know, and maybe in America, the important issue that the news only take it from the Israelis and from the sources of Israelis.
So this morning I saw a graffiti on the security wall of 2 Palestinians throwing rocks, and it said, "We will win."
Throwing stones, it's maybe the way, and it's not a violence. Throwing stones against the occupation.
What does it mean for you to win, and how do you think you can win?
To win, to get rid of the occupation, and to build our state. Our strategy now, in order to work against occupation peacefully, without violence. And we will not return to violence, now and in the future. Our rights, we will get it with the help of the international world.
To have peace according to this United Nations resolution. We don't need peace talkers, we need peacemakers.
We do hope that one day we with our Israeli neighbors, we can reach peace and have better future for our children and our future generation.
I noticed that in the hotel that I'm staying, there's a swastika on the outside. And I know that that is an old ancient symbol, but I also know that in my culture, it has been abused in a huge genocide against the Jews. And I just wanted to have your opinion on how do those symbols affect peace attempts, because I know that everybody is pro-peace, but I also think it sends a message to have such a symbol on a public space. So I wonder why you leave it there if it's obviously very sensitive for peace negotiations to happen.
Yes. Actually, we all know that the Jews have suffered during the Second World War. But what we cannot understand is how a nation that have suffered and have experienced very hard circumstances can apply the same sanctions and the same practices on other nations. They should be the last nation that should apply that kind of humiliating or bad practices for people. The people who have drawn that symbol is mentioning the similarity between that regime and the existing Israeli regime. Because if you compare it, you will have it the same. Palestinians have separate streets. They are not allowed to drive their car on the Israeli streets. We are living in ghettos. Beit Lahem is surrounded with a gate and with a wall. Where else can you find these gates and walls? We have high restrictions on our movement. I am prevented to use the Israeli airport or the airport that exists in Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport. We are not allowed to construct our own airport. Such circumstances and such kind of attitude do not only exist in history. And one of the similarity was the regime that was set by Hitler.
The Israelis were treating them the same way that the Nazis were treating the Jews. And for me, that was so hard for me to keep a straight face. Because how dare you make that comparison? That's no comparison at all. And for children to grow up having to hear that, it's infuriating.
His answer was, it might just be a sign on how the Palestinian people feel treated by the Jewish people. That is an audacity to say. And I think that everybody who has even just 1% of an objective perspective can totally agree on that.
So we left the mayor and went on to meet the Minister of Tourism. And during that meeting, she then goes on to say, Bethlehem is a peaceful city.
We do our best to explain that here in Palestine, we don't have terrorism, we don't have ISIS. All Palestinians would love to see tourists from all over the world. If this occupation ends, then we'll be like the whole tourism sector will develop, and we'll be talking about a different kind of tourism sector, not the way we see it now, but more and more millions.
If you were to describe the Israeli and Palestinian situation in one word, what would you say and why?
Occupation and occupier. People above the law and people under the law. Occupation is occupation. Occupation means having your freedom, living freely in your own state, independently.
We met with Pastor Naim of a church in Bethlehem. We questioned about what it was like with the occupation. What do you think about the occupation? He just turns around and goes, "What occupation?"
No occupation.
Okay.
Well, I mean, Palestinians control the West Bank. Where is the occupation? Whoever told you we are under occupation, where's the occupation? We completely under Palestinian Authority.
That kind of changed my perspective, because the day before I had been just believing blindly everything that was said as truth, but then a lot of what they were saying just completely flipped what I was perceiving.
What occupation? That, to me, when he said that, I started laughing, because suddenly everything became so simple, and I started thinking, I had not seen one IDF soldier in the whole time I was in Bethlehem. I had not seen one Israeli flag. I had not seen one institution of Israel.
What occupation? To me, that said, I've heard lies. I've been lied to by the politicians in this area. I cannot trust the politicians in this area.
She said, occupier and the ones who are occupied, above the law and under the law. But at that same night, I am at a house, at a meeting. We were feeding the poor, and I speak to a high-ranking woman in the authorities. And she shows me a picture next to the doorstep of her husband. And with a smile on her face, she says, "Oh, this is my husband. He's in prison for life, for crimes." She didn't elaborate on why, but he was captured by the IDF soldiers. And she says that, right, like 2 hours after somebody tells me, oh, the Israelis are above the law and the Palestinians are victims of the law. And whilst it evoked a lot of frustration in me and anger, at the same time, I could feel that I really have problems empathizing with people that are so blinded by hatred.
A lot of us were taken aback by that, but if you see it from their eyes, that's almost like a hero, because he's fighting for what they are trying to achieve.
Palestinian perspective would be this, that, hey, this is our homeland. We've lived here for generations. In fact, some of our families go back 10 generations. Now we live in second-class citizens in our own country. It's not fair, it's not right, and the world sits around and just watches this happen. Israel, with all of its military might and all of this, they treat us like dogs, and we have a right to the land. It's our historic inheritance.
Palestinians feel threatened. The more threatened we find, the more threatened you are, the more likely you will support violence against those who threaten you.
Everybody is hating on everyone, and they don't even have a clear mind to separate. They can't separate. So what am I supposed to do? I can't even be really mad at them because they're victims of their own hatred.
One of my main goals for this trip and for this documentary was to truly hear the true Palestinian side of the story and not what we hear and see throughout social media. And man, were my expectations met.
So what does it say here about this young man? Because I remember seeing his picture on the news, and he blew up a bomb in Jerusalem that was a few blocks away from where I was, and I was just a few blocks away and almost took that bus. And it's incredible that he would be willing to kill me, actually.
We're now in Bethlehem, and we're going to walk towards a refugee camp and meet with a representative from Fatah.
When our young generation-to-generation investigators first ventured into the now Palestinian town of Bethlehem, besides the birthplace of Jesus, they discovered a birthplace of raw emotions against Israel. Near the Palestinian-held Area A, at the refugee camp, they met up with a Fatah agent whom we'll call Mohammed. Fatah is a Palestinian political and military organization founded in 1959 by Yasser Arafat and others to promote Palestinian nationalism and the establishment of a Palestinian state, which is now Israel. Fatah is more moderate than the Hamas group who helped comprise the Palestinian National Authority, standing for the release of Palestinians from what they consider to be Israeli occupation and abuses.
According to the agreement, this is like from this stone, this was one of the mark. The land behind it, they call it Area A. Area A is supposed to be under the Palestinian jurisdiction, so it's not allowed for an Israeli soldier to come to arrest or to shoot anyone, and this didn't happen at all because they are coming every single night to arrest and to shoot people.
I know the IDF and the moral code of the IDF. I've done a lot of research on it, and I know how the IDF works to improve itself constantly, how it has literally the highest moral standard out of any army, including the United States, which I did a lot of research on as well. One of the biggest issues I have is when people make the Palestinians powerless, because they're not.
In 1967, the Israeli occupation decided to occupy the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and they take around 80% of our land. We're controlling the life, the economic, the political life, anything had been controlled by the Israeli occupation. The time 1967 until the first Intifada began. Intifada, it's a small concept for revolution. Yeah, but Palestinians decide to call it Intifada because you do as much as you can with the things that you have. Palestinians use a small stone to protect themselves and to throw it to the soldier as action or as to show to the Israeli occupation that they refuse their order, they refuse their own occupation, and they want to have their own freedom.
I mean, would you guys consider rock throwing violent or non-violent?
Violent.
Violent. I think, again, in the Western world, I think everyone would say if you're throwing a rock, that's violence, right? You can cause great harm to somebody with a big rock. Whereas, so for us, it's clear-cut violence. But for them, maybe you guys heard this, I don't know, but they say rock throwing in their minds is a non-violent activity. It's like we encourage our kids to go out and throw rocks because that's non-violent.
This Intifada stayed for 3 years. It faced by extremely violence by the soldier. Many people had been shot.
So I'm wondering, how is it fair to have an armed IDF soldier with an automatic gun weapon and a 13-year-old with a Molotov cocktail? How is it fair to let these two run against each other?
I would argue it's the question, right, of like this imbalance. My question would be, if that kid, why does that kid need to pick up the rock? Our army is not battling with an average Palestinian. That's not their role. Their role is to take on terrorists. And terrorists do have those weapons, and terrorists do have those capabilities of harming our soldiers. You should put them on the same level. The innocent Palestinian shouldn't be involved in those exchanges.
The stone that here behind us, this memorial, for the first part of it, it's for the Palestinian martyr who had been killed in the first Intifada, while they were throwing a stone to the soldier to say no for them.
I remember seeing on the wall, it made me really think the Palestinians are wondering why Israelis are just so cruel to them, and it's almost like a racist hatred, you know?
From the Palestinian viewpoint, we've been driven out by Israel, and Israel's forces have been murderous. Israeli soldiers can come in, settlers come into our land and commit atrocities against us, and there's no justice. The Israeli viewpoint would be, listen, it's the same old story. If the Palestinians would put down their weapons, there'd be no more war. If the Israelis would put down their weapons, there'd be no more Israel.
So what does it say here about this young man? Because I remember seeing his picture on the news, and he blew up a bomb in Jerusalem that was a few blocks away from where I was, and yeah.
Okay, his name, Abdul Hamid Abu Sroor. He is like one of the members of my family. Abdul Hamid, he was one of the smartest kids in the camp, and he was educated, and he was studying science in Bethlehem University. Abdul Hamid decided to bomb himself after the Israeli in February killed his own cousin and his best friend. His name is Sroor Abu Sroor. They shot him while he was going to his university. They shot him in his chest in Beit Jala. And Beit Jala, it's a village supposed to be in Area A, and it's supposed to be under the Palestinian jurisdiction, and it's not allowed for any Israeli soldier to be there and to shoot him. So as a reaction about what he's facing in his life, about the tear gas that he's smelled like every single day in the camp, the raids, and about like the way how the soldier killed his own grandfather in Lebanon. There is no many hopes for them.
They were saying that that he blew himself up because he had, the month before, he lost his best friend, he lost his cousin or something, and so
Did he say how or why or?
Why? Because
Like
they said for no reason from an Israeli sniper.
Our snipers will never shoot an innocent civilian. They have a clear shot of what's going on because they're at a distance. Snipers are there for one reason and one reason only, and that's to ensure the safety of the soldiers on the ground. So our rules of engagement are super duper strict, and the idea that a sniper is going to be there picking off people just doesn't happen.
Do IDF soldiers shoot innocent Palestinians?
No.
And how do you
No.
ensure?
This is what happens. This is what happens. Riots will oftentimes break out. With riots, we will almost never use active bullets. We will use rubber bullets, but there are occasions where riots will become deadly. And as a result, then they will switch to live ammunition and people will get shot. However, and then the question that we now have to ask ourselves is, what is innocent? If you're throwing a Molotov cocktail at soldiers, are you innocent in that moment? Even if you're a 16-year-old kid, right? And that's where they would say, well, that's nonviolent. He was just throwing a Molotov cocktail. And so he's innocent. He's an innocent civilian. Where we would say, well, no, in that moment, you were a combatant.
Each one of them decide how to resist the occupation in his own way. Abdulhamid decide to bomb himself, yes, but in the same time there is another decide to write about the occupation and to make a film about it. So every single one have done what he believe about could make change for him.
I'm really shaken now to see the picture of the boy that blew up a bus in Jerusalem that I was almost on. I was a few blocks away when it happened, and to hear the story that many of his family members were actually killed in wars and by Israeli soldiers, and because of that frustration and no hope, he decided to kill others. And it can seem so hopeless at times that he would kill someone like me.
One of the children who had been killed, he was 15 years old, was playing in the street. They shot him also in this street from this watchtower.
You know, you talked about a 13-year-old boy, right, who was shot by, or potentially shot by an Israeli sniper. That's the story that you were told. Well, there's a ton of context missing from that story. Right. For me, I can't take that for fact. I can only take for fact like the evidence that I have in front of me. This is a very specific situation that if that were true, if the case were true that he was playing soccer and he was shot by an IDF soldier, I can guarantee you that this IDF soldier would be put on trial. Yeah. But why is it that teenagers are engaging in riots that become violent? Why are teenagers being put in this place? Why are their parents allowing them to go in this situation when they know that violence can erupt and that the Israeli military will respond?
They talk a lot that they teach peace to the kids. But the kids, where they live, they just see so much conflict, so much war, like so much killing, that's deep in their hearts. So it's so hard to change their mind, their mindset, like because they live in this environment.
How can there be peace when war is at the very least not condemned?
One of the children who had been killed, he was 15 years old, was playing in the street. They shot him also in this street from this watchtower.
Actually, I remember one distinct story at a refugee camp of a little boy being shot, 13 years old, shot by the IDF. And I was wondering what you would say towards those claims.
The IDF are heavily criticized all around the world during conflicts, and people scrutinize them, the media. So we're going to give the young people the opportunity to ask them difficult questions for themselves. And we're going to meet with an intelligence expert who served in the IDF for over 25 years.
During their days with the Palestinian Authority, our young international researchers heard accounts of Israeli heavy-handedness, inequality, and brutality. So when they had the opportunity to interview members of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and another security analyst, they were anxious to ask some pointed questions and discern both sides of the story. Their first series of interviews found them in Tel Aviv.
I am Major H. I've been flying operational missions all over the Middle East.
Last week we were allowed to spend a couple days in Bethlehem, and during our stay there we talked to a lot of Palestinian people and also heard stories of a 13-year-old shot by the IDF. And I was wondering what you would say towards those claims.
There cannot be a direct order for a soldier to shoot a 13-year-old guy. So I'm telling you this story to tell you about one interesting target that I had of a terrorist staying in a house and shooting our troops on the ground. And the intelligence about that target said that that terrorist might be staying with his two daughters, 3 and 5 years old. And during protective aid, I occupied the role of the close air support officer of the Air Force. Whenever our troops on the ground encounter a target that has threatened them, they can send it to the Air Force for it to be attacked. After they do the checks and all the preparations they have to do at the division level, they send it to the next station, which is the Air Force. This is where I stood, where I was, and in the protective edge. We do the planning, we decide how are we going to help our troops on the ground and whether or not we're going to do the attack. I took the target and I pushed it to the bottom of the stack. Every officer in the process did exactly the same thing that I did. When the time to attack it has come, I took the target and went to the officer in charge and for him to approve the attack. And he said, well, I see that you considered everything very, very carefully in order to minimize the damage, but I'm afraid I cannot approve it. And all this was because the enemy shooting at our troops might be staying with his two daughters, 3 and 5 years old.
Yeah, I found interesting is the morality of the IDF. They really go through things and they really check if this is morally right, and just like how you said, they go through like 4 or 5 different segments to see if this target is able to be shot at, if there's no children in the way, if there's no innocent people or innocent lives in the way.
Can you give some specific details that you learned about engaging in warfare and moral code and behavior?
Yes. So one of the operations, we got explicit intelligence where is the leader of Hamas in Tulkarem is hiding. But they use the local poor population, sometimes kids, sometimes teenagers, to hide there, to use them for terror. We got the exact indication where he was staying. He wasn't staying in his house, he was staying in a safe house for him in the most crowded area. Because they know how are we fighting. They use our moral code, they use our moral standards against us. Because they know that if they surround themselves with citizens or they're in the middle of the crowded area, that we won't send a plane, we won't send a pilot to bomb it. We decide to send a ground team by ground, going through those narrow streets where we're the minority, but to grab only that specific terrorist and come back with them to Israel and bring them to trial. And once we were in place, middle of the night, we start announcing, you're surrounded from all over, and about a minute later, we notice him trying to run away from the roof. So the team on the other roof started chasing him. Very quickly, he pulled out a gun and tried to shoot. Right before he shot, one of our guys managed to shoot him in the leg. The terrorist fell. The medic from our team, from the team that was on the roof, jumped over the roof and started bandaging his leg. Meanwhile, my team on the ground, the team that surrounded the house, we ran inside to the 3rd floor with a stretcher, and we found ourselves on the roof trying to bandage his leg and put the terrorist on the stretcher while the entire area woke up and we started getting hit by huge rocks. Even an air conditioner flew at us. Everything that they could grab on, they threw at us. We look up and we see it's 16, 17, maybe 15-year-old kids. We know from our intelligence, they're being paid by Hamas, putting those kids in danger against armed personnel. We managed to run down the stairs with a stretcher back to the base, and in general, the operation was a success.
But I'd probably freak out and not know what to do. But they kept their calm because they kept the mission in front of them, and they knew that it was more important for the civilians to be safe than for themselves.
So during the debriefing, because it was a high-ranked terrorist, there was a lot of high-ranked officers, and we had a foreign officer that came to see, part of a cooperation with the IDF, so he listened to everything, and then he said, 2 things I don't understand. you knew the exact location and even the window of the apartment he was hiding in. Why didn't you shoot? And the second one was when your soldiers were under fire, you didn't react. You put your soldiers in danger in a hostile territory. I don't understand that. This is the way the IDF works. I do think that we're the most moral army fighting the most unmoral war.
You know, the United Nations has condemned Israel more than any other nation on earth, not the Soviet Union when millions were killed, not communist China when millions were killed, but this tiny little nation of Israel that actually has hospitals treating the terrorists who tried to blow up Israelis.
I work with the Israel Defense Forces, I work with the hospitals, and I've seen over and over again how they even go out of their way to save a victim who's been injured, even if it's an enemy in battle, because they're so sensitive to what it's like to be a refugee, to be without a homeland, to be in need of care and the great value of life.
When you're in the IDF, the first weeks, you learn ethics. That's where they start, with ethics. You have an ethics card. Parents will email and say, hey, our kids are on the front lines now, but it's not safe for them because they have to do all these extra things and take all these extra precautions to make sure that they don't take Palestinian lives.
I was very impressed by the IDF after I got a clear insight about what kind of measures they actually take to save lives on Israeli side as well as on Palestinian side. It got me thinking because, I mean, they might have been successful in decreasing the outbursts of terror, but have they really been successful in taking the breeding ground for terror?
From an Islamic perspective, this breeding ground for terror is bigger than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, it's painfully seen by Muslim against Muslim. To get further perspective, our truth seekers would hazard a visit with a former Israeli senior official on Arab affairs near the volatile Syrian border, only a few short miles from that raging civil war.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the end of the day, is a very small component in the large picture. The Middle East reality shapes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict does not shape the Middle East reality. And right happening to my back, and that is the war in Syria. So you could see the smoke rising over there. This is the smoke out of shooting. Tank shooting, artillery shootings. You're looking at a war zone.
Israel is in the middle of this, surrounded by enemies and also facing interior threats. So what does the future hold for this tiny state?
When you look at the future to come, you see significant challenges as far as Israel is concerned, but also interesting opportunities. For the first time in the history of Israel, there is an interesting joint strategic interest between Israel and major Arab states to block, to minimize, to thwart back the Iranian expansion. Second is to block and to minimize as much as possible the expansion of a militant Islamist radical groups that are not only threatening Israel. These groups are presenting a serious threat to every single Arab state, because their ideology calls upon the toppling down of the political structure in the Arab and Muslim world in order to establish what they envision to be the caliphate, the one big global entity.
We saw with our own eyes the civil war raging on in Syria. That makes Israel shine out all the more as a beacon of light in this dark region. And it made me understand how vital it is for Israel to have safe borders and to be strong as a country.
The Israelis started to build, I'm sure you have seen it already here, the separation wall.
Bethlehem is surrounded with a gate and with a wall. Where else can you find these gates and walls?
Now we have the wall everywhere in Palestine. Did we get our independence? Did the occupation end? It didn't end.
Another hot topic are the barriers or the walls. Many of you will have heard the controversies about them. We don't just want the young people to meet with leaders. We want them to understand what it's like for the average local person. And what better way to do that than to actually experience a checkpoint? He is the architect of the barriers, and he's going to talk to them and give them an opportunity to ask him the difficult questions.
Many Muslims are vehemently against the wall, believing that it, along with Israel's checkpoints, are among the biggest barriers to Middle East peace. This outcry has put the Jews' backs against the wall in their attempts to balance freedoms with the need to protect Israeli and Palestinian citizens against terrorism. To excavate the facts regarding all these claims, our young researchers interviewed the man responsible for building the wall, the fences, and the checkpoints, retired IDF Colonel Danny Terza.
Well, today I'll take you for a very short tour in Jerusalem, trying to share with you some of the dilemmas that I had to face when I got the mission from the Israeli government to design and build a security fence. All the houses in front of you are in the West Bank, so we are just on the municipal boundary of Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem, Israel, and here it's the West Bank. I heard that you were in Bethlehem, so this is Bethlehem. We'll talk about it in a minute. If you look to the valley, you can see there are two roads here. One road where the traffic runs on, second road, nobody on it, and then you can see a wire fence. This wire fence is the security fence. Wherever you have seen the security fence in the media, they always show you those concrete walls. Well, of course, there are concrete walls. You can see some of them there on the mountain. We will be there, we will talk about them. But please remember, only 5% of this big project of 451 miles long are concrete walls. All the other are wire fences. As you can see down the valley here, you'll never see them in the media.
On the Palestinian side, we always heard that by building the fence and the wall, Israel stole Palestinian land because it was not on the original border.
Nobody is against that you will build a wall on your piece of land. It's not in the borders of the others. Big part of this wall on our land.
This fence is only a temporary security measure. The border will be decided in the negotiations, in the agreement between the sides, when it will be, when the Palestinians want to come back to the negotiation table, we can agree about the lines and about taking lands. If we are entering Palestinian private lands, we offer the people compensation. Once for the damage that we are doing to the lands, an annual payment for the use of this land. I have to be honest with you, most of these farmers didn't come to take the compensation because they were afraid from the Palestinian Authority that they will say that they are cooperating with Israel.
How effective is the security fence / wall?
Okay, the security fence is very effective. From 2000 till the end of 2006, we had in Israel about 4,000 terror attacks. We lost in this period 1,526 people that were murdered in terror attacks inside Israel. From January 2007, that most of the fence was completed, till today, we had in Israel from the West Bank only 31 terror attacks, and we lost in this period 27 people.
The murder rate went down well over 90%. So you tell me any other country that is going to allow murderers to come in, snipers to come in, to pick off your children, your women, your men, and when you could simply put up a barrier to stop it.
The fence is only the infrastructure on the ground. It's the soldiers that work 24 hours a day. It's the intelligence, it's the Secret Service, it's the cooperation with the Palestinian Authority and the coordination with the Palestinian police. Now we are just 45 centimeters from Bethlehem, with 45 centimeters of concrete. So a lot of people says to me, we don't like your fence, but we can understand why you build it. Here in the West Bank, we let about 120,000 Palestinians come every day to Israel. The soldiers were afraid that someone will come with explosive belt on himself. So we went to a lot of places around the world. We learned security systems, and we came back here, and I have built this terminal that you can see here.
We went through the checkpoint, and for that, to have to do that every single day with thousands of people for hours every morning, I could see why that frustration builds. But I think the problem with that is they don't see why the wall is necessary. They just see it as a hindrance and an infringement upon their daily lives.
When they establish the wall, they create a pyramid system. So there is 4 types of pyramid system. The first one from West Bank, Gaza Strip, it's not allowed for any of the Palestinians to go and visit their families or to see their friends, or if you want to go to visit anyone in Gaza Strip, it's not allowed for us to go or for they to come and for us to go. So there is no connection between us.
If you're a Palestinian and you want to come to Israel, you can have this magnetic card. Inside the magnetic card there is some biological information about you, so you cannot give it to someone else, but it's not enough. You need to have like a visa to come to Israel. We don't have the equipment to check cars as fast as needed, so you have to leave your car in the Palestinian side and walk from this big gate to the terminal. It's only 50 meters, but we need this space to see that no one is carrying a rifle or something heavy on his back. Just in the last year, in 2015, in 1 year, we caught in one terminal 18 pipe bombs that people try to smuggle to Israel. So it's very effective, and it takes you not more than 20 minutes in the rushest hour to cross from one side to the other side. I have to admit, in morning time, there are very long queues in the Palestinian side because a lot of Palestinian workers want to come to take the work in Israel. Sometimes you have to wait there even 2 hours.
On Sunday, we got to experience the checkpoints. Now that was a really important experience to make for me because walking through all those boundaries and those different, like the X-ray machines and the metal detectors and showing your passport, and it took us, I think it took us like a good 20 minutes maybe. Imagine doing that in the morning with 3,000 people. I can so understand any kind of frustration that a Palestinian citizen or anybody who has to cross this checkpoint on a daily basis feels.
Because they think this serves security. But it certainly creates additional problems for that same army by radicalizing the population.
But as this fence is so effective for Israel, it made a lot of troubles to the Palestinians. And I tried, as I can, to minimize the damage to the Palestinian day-to-day life. I tried to construct as many checkpoints as I can. I tried to bring the best equipment to these checkpoints that it will be as smooth as possible. I tried to train the soldiers to be polite to the Palestinians.
What was the attitude of the Palestinians while they were going through the checkpoints?
I had people that hated me. I saw people that they just come with the eyes of, wow, if I had the chance, you know, like that kind of face. And I also saw people that they were, wow, thank you for being here. I actually felt that they were regular people. And I started to feel a bit bad as a person. Because, you know, standing at the checkpoint, you are creating long lines that I need to wait around 3 hours just to get out from the city. But as you know, when a person, a citizen, decides to become a terrorist, they will look as innocent as any other regular law-abiding Palestinian citizen.
But the biggest problem was that in some places there were Palestinian villages that were built on the top of the mountains, and they had agricultural lands down the valleys. And when we construct the fence, we cut the way of these farmers to the lands. Of course, we didn't want to take their agricultural land. So I thought that the best solution will be to construct as many gates as we can. Every gate has to be open for half an hour in the morning, half an hour at noontime, half an hour at evening time. So if you have agricultural land in the Israeli side, you have to come at the exact time, cross to the Israeli side, and come back when the gate is open. It didn't work.
I live in a village just outside Ramallah. In order to go to my office from that village, which is just 10 kilometers from my office in Ramallah, I have to go through an Israeli checkpoint. That checkpoint could be easy, and they might wave me through very easily, but it might be half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. What happens if you are late half an hour to the market? You can't sell your produce anymore. So no matter what business you're in, if you are a Palestinian, your life is controlled by an Israeli army that is a foreign army.
Today, there are less gates, only one gate for each village. But this gate is open from morning time till evening time. So if you have agricultural lands in the Israeli side, you can come to the checkpoint with your tractor, with your equipment, with your workers, have security check, cross to the Israeli side and come back to the Palestinian side, and we don't get any complaints about this system anymore. One day will come. I want to be the one that will take off the first stone of the wall in Jerusalem. I love this city so much. I have so many friends in the other side. So really I hope that they will come and we can remove it and live here normally and quietly with our neighbors, the Palestinians.
The very man who built all of this actually dislikes it. And he said he would be the first to take it down if it's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Israel's settlement policy has made the idea of a two-state solution no longer practical in the eyes of almost 60% of the Palestinians.
All these settlements are illegal, and if they believe in the two-state solution and having two states, so these settlements should not be expanded anymore.
One of the first times that I heard this word settlements, I was, what does that mean? And one of the first people that described for us was from the Palestine side. We got the opportunity to go there and see with our own eyes.
Another huge controversy is around the settlements. When the young people were in the Palestinian Authority, they heard from officials, they heard from people on the ground about the settlements and what it meant to them. And so now we're in the Israeli side and we're going to go and visit some of those settlements, find out what the people are saying, and again, what are the authorities saying in Israel?
The first stop for our truth seekers is to pay a visit to one of the numerous Israeli settlements sprinkled throughout the West Bank, coexisting right alongside many Palestinian communities. Politically, from the Palestinian Authority point of view, these Israeli neighborhoods are deterrents to peace, but incentives for peace from Israel's perspective. From ground level, our young people are about to discover that media spin is far different from everyday life.
In the lookout around, we can see two populated areas, Ramallah and Jerusalem. But the west of Judea and Samaria looks like that area. A lot of open space. Every now and again you'll see the area dotted with Jewish towns, Arab towns. Over here you'll see Tel Zion with the red houses. Down in the valley you'll see Mukhmas.
Here's a map of settlements today. What you see in light gray are Palestinian communities. What you see in dark gray are Jewish settlements. And the size of that circle, it's telling you how many people live there. You see these little dots? Those are all Jewish settlements. Another argument that we often hear is that settlements are gobbling up the territory in the West Bank, right? That where are the Palestinians going to live if you guys keep building your settlements?
The most important thing is the settlements. Now we have over 600,000 settlers in Palestine.
I don't remember the number of the settlements on our land, on the occupied land. 22% is for Palestine. When it comes to the 22% of Palestine, they are building settlements to take from the 22% another percentage, 2 or 5%.
This argument is over 2% of this territory. If we are to divide this territory and have all Jews on one side and all Palestinians on the other, the only way to achieve that would be to evict people from their homes. You guys see that on the map? It's the only way. There's no way to draw the lines around it, and we've already seen it because the breakdown of A, B, and C shows that to you as well, right? That in between all of those spots, there's Jewish settlement. Area A, guys, is administered entirely by the Palestinian Authority. There is no Israeli oversight in this area. So Israel withdrew from these territories entirely in 1994 and 1995. What makes up Area A is major Palestinian city centers. Approximately 17% of the West Bank and 55% of the Palestinians living in the West Bank live in Area A. Area B is under partial Israeli, partial Palestinian control. Palestinian civil control, meaning the healthcare, the infrastructure, the education is all governed by the Palestinian Authority, but the security oversight over that area is still in the hands of Israel. The area that makes up Area B is rural Palestinian villages. Okay, so the smaller areas on the outskirts of towns or in other areas throughout the West Bank. It covers 24% of the West Bank land, and approximately 41% of Palestinians live in Area B. There are no Jews in Area A or B, only Palestinians. And lastly, Area C. In terms of how this was negotiated, the Israelis and the Palestinians negotiated it together. Area C is under complete Israeli control. What makes up Area C are uninhabited lands in the West Bank, the major roadways in the West Bank, and Jewish settlements. So the only area that Jews live in the West Bank is Area C. Area C is again 59% of the West Bank, and 4% of the Palestinian population in the West Bank lives in Area C. And it's important to also remember that the Palestinians and the Israelis met and discussed these issues, and they both signed onto this.
This is a tiny country, but with a lot of more open space than people would think.
It seems that a lot of the neighborhoods are really close together. Is there any interaction?
So the interaction here obviously exists. It's changed along the years. It depends very much on the political situation, but still as people to people, there has been always interaction ever since the communities were established.
It seems very peaceful here and very nice, like a great environment to have a family. Why do you think it has become such an issue in the media then?
Working with the media, I can tell you that it's not interesting enough to write a story about football teams from a Palestinian village and an Israeli community that are playing against each other. And there's a lot of interests that are involved in this thing called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But when it comes to the political level, that's where things become more complicated. And part of what we're doing is to try and make the reality better, to make the coexistence more natural.
I remember watching the news a couple months back in a home in Germany. It was about settlements in Israel, and Israel was being criticized for it. A picture was displayed that said that settlements were violent. It was aggressive people filled with criminals that wanted to harm the Palestinian people. What I saw though was children on their bikes outside, dads pushing strollers with their children in it, a kindergarten, a synagogue, a supermarket, a playground. These were the things I saw. And it made me sad because there are real families out there that are suffering a great injustice in their reputation simply because the media is representing it in a totally different light.
It was really interesting because it's the opposite what they say. They are real people. They are a society, a community there, like families just living together. And one of the things that was really important for me, they have their reasons to be there. They are there because of historical reasons or family or whatever, and they are legal.
This is the Palestinian land. I need a state in order to live and to exist.
I think that we are beyond the point of deciding who is more worthy of this land. I'm a native, this is my house, this is my son's house, and I don't see us going anywhere. And I would not expect anybody to think that it's moral or logical to expect me to leave a place which is my home. However, we do have two populations here living together, having different national strives, and there are also humanitarian difficulties because of the situation over here, and that is something that we need to deal with.
We're taking people who are so different, Arabs and Jews and Islamists, Islamist Arabs and anti-Islamist Arabs and Jews who are very Orthodox and Jews who are anti-Orthodox and Jews who come from Ethiopia and Jews who come from Russia and Jews who were born here for the last 20 generations. And we're putting them all together and saying, we want everybody included in a conversation because part of the democracy's problem today is that people feel excluded. Either you give in to your fear and you start hating and fighting and you create terror and you go back to the old order.
Palestinians feel threatened. The more threatened we find, the more threatened you are, the more likely you will support violence against those who threaten you.
Or you build a shared society.
And many have said, look, let's have one state and everybody gets a vote, and as long as we have a strong Jewish majority, we'll be fine.
Can you separate between Israeli settlers who live in the West Bank and Palestinian population? The reality on the ground, most Palestinians, 59% of them say, is that we cannot separate between the two.
There is the possibility that if these settlements can develop and they can prosper and they can bring that prosperity to the surrounding Palestinian communities with jobs and working together, that would help everyone.
The people there just want to live in that territory because they think it's their homeland. They just feel so connected to it. So we visited a Jewish man originally from Jerusalem who lives in the West Bank now. And 16 years ago, he just came and built huts on a hill. And he said he didn't want to live in the city anymore. And so he just built his own small community with around 20 families. And it was incredible to see that they have so much fun there. He just enjoys the nature.
I'm a musician and I love to host. That's why I make this pub. It used to be a pub most of the time. Now it's a musical pub and a camping site. A lot of people come here to overnight, over 2 nights, over a week or whatever. And I got all the permits and everything. After I finished my army, I traveled a lot in the world.
Would you say that you and your community are welcomed here in this area?
Of course we are welcome. We don't have here a lot of Arab villages, so we don't have this conflict very intense. The non-Jewish neighbors here, we got a lot of Bedouins here, that they are Muslims, Arab, Palestinian. I don't have any illusion that it's pure love and that stuff.
Do you have any experiences of the conflict, or how has it affected your life?
It's everywhere and nowhere together. And why is that? I didn't came here because of ideological reason. Even though that I believe that Israel, it's for the Jewish, this is our homeland, this is the way, the place that everything starts for us, the beginning, the everything. But my goal was to make my dream.
He was playing multiple instruments, and then he said, we gotta make a band. He told me to come up, and I came up, and I played this bowl. It was totally funny because it was a bowl and it was like a stick. And I was like, how is this gonna work? And then he showed me this cool ring thing and how to hit it, and it was really fun. I loved it. And then when a bunch of people started coming and doing the different instruments, it like blessed my heart to see that.
What an international band! That's the way I like it.
These people have 7 seconds to get to shelter, between 7 and 15. These people will have 30 seconds.
Gaza. It's an area which fills our news constantly. And we're going to take our young people to the Gaza envelope. We're going to show them what the area is like for people that live right next to it.
Our millennials' view of the Gaza Strip from the Gaza envelope promised to be an eye-opening experience. The Palestinian area, which they will overlook, is completely under the control of the internationally recognized terrorist group called Hamas. Many attacks waged against Israel come from here. Hamas and some of the news agencies will frame their stories one way, while Israel has a different point of view. Our researchers are about to discover the truth from ground level.
Today we're going to talk about really the Gaza Strip, and specifically Hamas in the Gaza Strip. When Israel's dealing with Hamas, it's not like they're dealing with the Fatah Palestinian Authority, right? They're very much dealing with a terrorist organization that has no intention of compromising away any part of what they would call historic Palestine. Let's quickly look at some of the excerpts from the Hamas charter. There's no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad, through violence, through terrorism. Israel will exist until Islam will obliterate it just as it obliterated others before it. Let's look at the history a little bit. January of 2006, there's going to be elections in the PA, Palestinian Authority Parliament. and Hamas will win overwhelmingly in that election.
Okay, from 2006, rockets were going like crazy. A soldier named Gilad Shalit was kidnapped and smuggled into Gaza. Nobody knew where he was. We went in to try to find him.
They know that once they kidnap an Israeli soldier, that Israel will most likely negotiate with them for the release of prisoners. And that's exactly what happened. He will be held captive for over 5 years. For Israel, probably our biggest value is life. It's a huge value in Judaism. It's the thing that we say supersedes any other law in Judaism. 2011, in October, Gilad Shalit will be released by Hamas, and Israel will release 1,000 terrorists into the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. Israel will suffer an increase, an escalation of rocket fire from the Gaza Strip into Israel. This is obviously Hamas's predominant weapon that's used against Israel, and that's rockets.
Pillar of Defense, December 2012, I was called up for reserve duty. Rockets are increasing, and we are showing the Palestinians we're going to come in if we need to. A lot of airstrikes, a lot of damage was done on the Palestinian side, but another really important thing, for the first time, Israel gets the Iron Dome.
It's important to also look at the media. There's going to be low civilian casualty count on Israel's side because of all the efforts that Israel makes, and there's going to be a high civilian casualty count on the other side because of all the efforts Hamas makes to increase it. And when you cover this in war, when you cover this on the news, what you're basically going to see is 1,000 Palestinians, right? 6 Israeli civilians. And anyone who doesn't understand the context, the background, or know any of the facts that I just shared with you will say, oh my God, there's a massacre going on here, right? There's a natural imbalance that we then have to explain. And oftentimes the media is not explaining it.
The whole reason we went over during a war was just one reason, and that was try to fly in the face of the false reporting in America's media, and probably international media as well, of what was actually happening there. When rockets were being lobbed by Hamas from Gaza all over Israel, we met firsthand with not only military and governmental leaders, but even we met with Arab journalists who said Israel is attempting to defend herself, and she has a right to do so.
In Gaza, you are not allowed to cover Hamas firing a rocket. If you do, Hamas could kill you or kick you out of the Gaza Strip. What do we have here in Israel? A free press. With the free press, it's great. We can celebrate it. But with that means that anyone can report anything they want. But in Gaza, they're going to show you exactly where to go and exactly what they want you to report. And so what we will see coming out of the Gaza Strip throughout is people being wheeled into hospitals, right? The casualties in the hospitals, but we will never see the image of a Hamas terrorist firing a rocket into Israel. It will not happen.
The next stage, 2014, Operation Protective Edge kind of came about with the kidnapping of the 3 boys.
We sent troops into the area specifically of Hebron, Hebron being a Hamas stronghold in the West Bank, and the area around where the boys were kidnapped. And we will basically clamp down on the city and go door to door, tunnel to tunnel, trying to find these boys. During the process, we will arrest over 400 Hamas terrorists, trying to interrogate them, trying to get any information that we could on the boys' whereabouts.
Later, we found out that they were murdered within probably a few hours, but we couldn't find them for 3 weeks.
Hamas in Gaza will now be watching as Israel is arresting all of these Hamas terrorists in the West Bank. And so they will start launching rockets from Hamas, from Gaza into Israel. And by June 15th, we will have almost 1,500 rockets launched into Israel.
At the same time, there were Israeli extremists who then murdered a 13-year-old boy, Muhammad Abu Qadir, in Jerusalem as retaliation regarding those 3 boys that were kidnapped and murdered. And they started throwing extreme rockets against Israel, about 4,500 rockets towards Israel. And that's what kind of made Israel decide, we're going into this new operation. We can't let this go by. They can't think that they can send rockets to Israeli civilians and get away with it.
We will see rockets being launched towards Israel's 2 major cities, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
Hamas has these new rockets, courtesy of our friends in Iran. Okay, the Fajr 5. We're going to see some of its remnants in our next stop. The police station of Sderot, I don't know what you guys collected at home. They collect rockets. I'm going to give you guys like a how to hide from rockets 101, okay? One option, if you have a shelter, wonderful, run to the shelter. If you live in this town, you have between 7 to 15 seconds, depends where in this town you live. This is the city of Sderot. If you don't have a hiding place, you don't have a shelter, the best thing to do is just lay down on the floor. The other option is Iron Dome. right? We have batteries of Iron Dome stationed all over this area, all over the coast, the Gaza envelope, and they protect you. Not every rocket do we send an Iron Dome protection for, okay? Because it's not one rocket, it's two, okay? Only the ones that are aimed to hit in civilian areas that people are populated in, only then do we shoot up an Iron Dome, because it's very, very costly. You know how much that thing costs? What you're holding right now? $70,000 for one rocket. Now imagine every rocket they throw at us, we need to launch two. $140,000 like that.
And it has successfully taken out 98% of the missiles. If you're too close to the Gaza Strip, the Iron Dome does not work for you. It doesn't work on mortars. So if you live in a community that's within a few miles from the blue line, from the line that surrounds Gaza, then you still live under rocket fire until today. Every rocket or mortar that is launched in your direction will land, meaning that you, as a citizen, have 15 seconds to find shelter. And as a result of this, there are now cities in the south that are literally what we call bomb shelter cities.
Our little friend here, Ori, he's 10 years old, and he says he hasn't known one summer without rockets. Having a playground that is completely rocket-proof for children to play is completely normal. Each one of these caterpillars is 30 centimeters deep, what is approved by the Ministry of Defense as rocket-proof. If you can see, if you poke your head inside, there's an orange or yellow line. Basically, every kid knows that when the siren goes off or when the code red sign goes off, they need to run in all the way as deep as they can, and whoever's beyond that orange line or orange-yellow line is safe.
And these children that play at the playground, they play in and around these bomb shelters, but they're there that when rockets are fired from the terrorists and of Hamas from the Gaza Strip, which is literally within eye distance, that they can quickly hide from the rockets that are aimed at them to kill them.
If there would be rules on how to fight fair, Israel goes above and beyond to fulfill those measures. I mean, just look at how they try to warn civilians, how they try to save lives. They carry out pamphlets, they send text messages, they try everything to evacuate the area. They try to fight with reason. Terror is an idea that comes from the source of insanity. But Israel finds itself in this dilemma that they don't have a choice because they're trying to save lives. So this progress, that is absolutely no progress in Gaza, makes peace negotiations with Palestine so difficult because the people in Palestine and Gaza are trying to be unified. They belong together. So what do? Because if you look at the media and how they're reporting on this whole issue, they always point their finger on Israel. What is Israel not doing? What are they doing wrong? To be honest, that's kind of frustrating. Or maybe it's not frustrating. Maybe I'm actually hitting on the root of anti-Semitism.
Hitler's about to take power in Germany. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws are going to be passed, and Jews now are going to start looking around for where to flee. And Zev Jabotinsky will now take on the role of trying to get Jews out of Germany and get them into Palestine. And throughout the war, the British will refuse to lift that quota.
I come from the country that did that, and I feel like it's part on us.
So we wanted to take the young people to Yad Vashem, an important place here in Jerusalem, to be able to see what happened during the horrors of the Holocaust.
This will be a very challenging experience for them mentally and emotionally. And so we wanted them to be able to debrief, and who better to debrief with than a rabbi who actually lives in Jerusalem.
The Holocaust was one of the darkest chapters in Jewish history. Though it was scripted by Hitler and the Nazi regime, it was sadly co-authored by many other nations. Our international millennials are about to speed read through the past which led to the tragedy in hopes of inspiring today's youth to help inscribe a happier ending. This endeavor will begin with a trip to the Stand With Us offices, include a heart-to-heart rendering trip to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, and end by visiting an Orthodox rabbi whose viewpoint marks the resilience of the Jewish people.
But we've had a quota on our immigration. So much of that immigration is now going to be illegal immigration by Jews into this area, fleeing Nazi Germany. And the white papers in 1939 are going to limit Jewish immigration within 6 months, World War II is gonna start. Germany is going to invade Poland. Jews now are gonna be trying to flee to anywhere, and they will have nowhere to go, including to Palestine. And throughout the war, the British will refuse to lift that quota. War ends in 1945. 6 years of Holocaust, 6 years of genocide, because some of the Jews are super angry at the British. How could you? How could you watch as Jews were being slaughtered in Europe and you did nothing about it? And you could have, you just had to open the border.
One of the things that probably struck me was when Charlotte was saying about how the British didn't lift the borders up during the Second World War. So the Jews who were trying to flee into Israel, they couldn't, and therefore they were stuck in Europe and they were going through concentration camps and stuff. And that kind of feels like we're part to blame for the number of Jews that were slaughtered or that suffered during the Holocaust, and that kind of makes me really frustrated and sad.
At the very least then, we need a homeland. We can defend ourselves. We need a homeland so that, let's say Jews in France come under increasing persecution. There's a place where they can flee. Let's say something collapses in America. There's a place where Jews can flee. They didn't have that option before. You had like the boat the St. Louis that left Europe with Jewish refugees and was refused entry into the United States and then ended up back in Europe during World War II with most of those Jews getting slaughtered in concentration camps.
If you would ask me, what did Jews think? Why did God do what he did or allowed to happen? What happened? The answer would be, we have no idea. What we know is God does what he does because he wants people to react in a certain way. The Holocaust was not a judgment on Israel as much as it was a judgment on the world. As much as the people who were sent to the concentration camps were undergoing something, the rest of the world that didn't do anything, or that could have and should have but didn't, were also being judged.
All I'm taking away from this is basically, don't be scared to be the victim, be scared to be the perpetrator. Because it's easier than you think to just go with the flow and stop thinking about your actions. I believe there is the potential for a Hitler in every generation.
Martin Luther might have been a great theologian, but he couldn't figure the Jews out. He ended up writing words that were so filled with hatred that when Hitler writes Mein Kampf, he quotes Martin Luther. That needs a change.
Martin Luther, I've taken people on tours of Germany to go to those locations. But tragically, there is one component of his writings that is all too well known, was used by Hitler as his justification for what he would later do. So there is an undertow periodically of this anti-Semitism, most of which we're not aware of when we do a general reading of the history.
So let me tell you two Jewish understandings. One is man was being judged, not Jews and non-Jews, the world was being judged. I'm going to create a situation that is in fulfillment of prophecy. You know, I'm going to take you out, you're going to be a curse and a byword, etc., but it's going to be so dramatic that it should shake up the world. And are they going to do anything about it? And when it's all over, are they going to do anything about it if the situation comes up again?
It was out of the ashes of the Holocaust that Israel was born, to be a refuge for the Jewish people, where it'd be safe. The original founders of Israel believed that if the Jewish people would come back to their homeland, there'd be no more hatred against Israel. Well, they were wrong.
Anti-Semitism in Europe for years now has been at levels just as high as right before the Holocaust. Certainly in the Middle East, it's just as high or higher. So Jews live in this constant existential battle that they realize that if they are not vigilant in their self-defense, that they could literally be wiped out.
This museum is proof of what happens when we stay silent. So don't be silent anymore.
Hollywood film producer Steven Spielberg was most famous for his movie that he made 20 years ago based on a true story called Schindler's List. In there, he depicted the miraculous story of 1,200 Jews who worked for a Nazi businessman, Oskar Schindler. This businessman's converted to being one that was not only their employer, but their savior. And today, we need more like him, these righteous among the nations, being brave enough to speak out and to demonstrate skill in helping to save lives. even lives of nations in this hour.
Back there, we saw that the church was just judging the people, judging the Jews, and also helping to kill. But today, we can make a decision. We can help to change this. We can change our generation.
We can't let this happen again. That's the test mankind is going through. Because God doesn't do anything or allow anything just for judgment's sake. Anytime God does something, it's for instruction. He's trying to teach us how to be more of what we need to be. And so for Jewish people, that was a test actually that in some ways we survived and recreated everything. Families, children, grandchildren. When I go to a friend of ours whose whole family were destroyed in the Holocaust, and they have a party with all their children and grandchildren, and the man who came out of the Holocaust hugs me and he says, "You see, I won." He says, when that Nazi trooper had his boot on my throat, he said, "You're never gonna leave this place. He's dead, and I'm here with 29 grandchildren." We won. Because survival and continuing to be in faith in survival is the ultimate answer to the Yad Vashem. That's why Yad Vashem, by the way, when you walk through it with all the difficulties, I don't know if you remember, but when you walked out towards the end, all of a sudden you saw an opening into a neighborhood and hills. That's life. That's the victory. All that darkness you saw suddenly had meaning, because when you realize that none of the things that happened during the Holocaust was coincidence. There's something going on, and we need to be taught out of that how to become more of what we need to be. God uses us to express himself, and we have to choose, are we going to make God glorious by acting in his merciful and compassionate manner? Or are we going to destroy that and become exactly the opposite?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I did not obey and listen to their opinions, leaders. They told me, preach the Bible. I said, yes, I am preaching the Bible. And when I asked one of the leaders, what do you mean preach the Bible? He said, the Bible is the New Testament. I said, I'm sorry. The Bible is not only the New Testament. The Bible is the 66 books, the infallible, inspired Word of God. And because of that, to make the story short again, our church was bombed 14 times. I was shot 4 bullets, one hit my left shoulder. The next day I said I was dead, but I'm still alive today.
What is it like for some of the minorities living here? And of course, one of the minorities is the Christians, many of whom have left, but some have stayed. And so we took them to a church to hear what the founding pastor had to say.
But we can't just stay there. We have to also look at what's happening now today and also the future.
Jews, Muslims, and Christians claim to have their roots in this most contested land. Some of this documentary is focused on a conflict between Islam and Judaism. To get a more complete picture, it's appropriate to discover how Christianity also plays a role in this unfolding drama. So having completed their quest for truth, the young people went to hear key leaders speak about biblical doctrine regarding the land of Israel and the Jewish people.
As a Christian Palestinian, we need to understand that we were taught when we were so young that the Bible is the New Testament, mainly the New Testament where they put so much emphasis on. And I knew after I got saved there is an Old Testament too. They told me, what do you need the Old Testament for? I said, yeah, it's part of the Bible. They said, no, that's a Jewish book. What shall I do with the prophecies concerning Jesus in the Old Testament?
After all, the New Testament doesn't make a lot of sense without the Old Testament.
The more I read the Old Testament, the more God opened my eyes, my heart, to have more love for the Jewish people. And you cannot love the Arabs and hate the Jews.
And the pastor was saying, you cannot love this and not love the other. The way that Jesus loves, he loves everyone.
He wants both people to come to the saving knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ.
This is a church who wants to bring this whole nation together.
our King commanded us to love our enemies. It's so beyond our human ability, especially if relatives have been killed or tortured or wounded or executed, and the natural human response is anger and revenge. I mean, even if you get power to crush your enemies in this generation, it just means your enemies' children are going to kill your children. All right, this is how it works in the Middle East. But if we could get a hold of that supernatural love your enemies that just goes beyond the human flesh, but if we, by faith and because of the sacrifice of Jesus, can get a hold of that power, we can change our enemies into friends.
You see, the Gentiles can't fulfill their destiny without the Jewish people. But on the other hand, the Jewish people cannot fulfill their destiny without the Gentile church either. It's a paramount issue. It's a crucial intersection issue of this generation to learn what it means to have the Jewish roots of faith, even if you don't practice it ritualistically, but to learn about it and what it means to your faith.
Meeting with Pastor Chad put everything in a different perspective. As Gentiles, we need the Jewish people.
You cannot love the King of Israel, the Messiah, Jesus, and hate his people or not love the people of Israel. Jesus, or Yeshua, wept over his people. That's his heart. He cried tears over Jerusalem, and he saw the future of his people. Well, if you name yourself by the name of Jesus, or as a Christian, you have to have the same heart for his people.
I do not belong to any political party. I belong to the kingdom of God. I belong to Jesus. Most evangelical churches in the Middle East, they believe in replacement theology. That the church replaced Israel today, and God has finished yet with Israel. What shall we do with Romans 9, 10, 11? God has not finished yet with Israel. Number one. Number two, the church does not replace Israel. I'm sorry, because God doesn't change his mind.
Jeremiah 31, we quote it all the time. It's about the new covenant. He's going to write it. He's going to make a new covenant. He's going to write it on the tablets of our heart. We will be his people. He will be our God. The problem is that he says, and in those days I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel. And you're like, well, so you got to do some what we call biblical gymnastics here. You either have to say, well, he didn't really mean Israel. Actually, he meant, and come up with some other interpretation. That's a belief. A lot of theologians believe that we call that replacement theology. Essentially, what that is that the church, essentially, we are the new Israel. Israel failed. God's like, okay, I'm done with you. Plan B.
Does that mean that all the other covenants that God made are now wiped away? That really the Noah covenant is no longer important? Now God can destroy the earth with a flood? Right? No, that doesn't make sense. Because for God to remain faithful to who he is, he also cannot lie. And when he says forever in this word, it means forever. And when God made those covenants with Abraham, when he made the covenant with the Israelites, they understood it to mean them physically. So for God to be true, all of those covenants have to also remain true.
But somehow when Israel, rejects their Messiah, we say, well, done with you, moving on to the next plan. And yet that's not what we see in the heart of God.
It really showed to me the danger of replacement theology, because when you replace Israel with the church, you're really missing out on all of those end times scriptures and prophecies.
There's 89 chapters in the Bible that focus on Jesus' first coming. And there's 150 chapters that focus on his second coming. That's almost twice as much information in the whole Bible that focus on Jesus' second coming. Therefore, God put all that information there for us to be informed.
The message in the Old Testament doesn't apply nowadays to us as believers, which it totally does. And I feel like things like that are subtle enough that it definitely can be seen as, is anti-Semitic. And doing a lot of things like when you read scripture or something, and maybe it's talking specifically to the people of Israel, and then almost ignoring that fact and not embracing that it's to Israel and then to us.
Paul talks a little bit about how we're all kind of part of the commonwealth of Israel in a spiritual sense, and that's absolutely true. But don't let that take away from your time reading the Old Testament scriptures, specifically the prophets. When Israel and the Jewish people are mentioned, it's referring to a real group of people and a real nation, a real place.
Yeah.
So you talked about that the Bible says 150 times or 100 something about the end of times, the returning of Jesus, and that most of these talks about Israel. Can you give us some examples in the Bible of scriptures?
Matthew 23, and he's speaking to a specific people. He's in Jerusalem speaking to the people of Jerusalem, and he's saying, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Jesus puts one of the conditions on his return connected to the people who live in this city, the Jewish people. You're not going to see me again. Now, if I was Satan and I knew that Jesus would not return until a specific group of people welcomed him as king, as Messiah, I would do everything I could to wipe that people out. Kill them, deceive them. I would put pressure on them. I'd get them out of that city. Anything I could do to silence and remove that people, I would do that. And that's exactly what we're seeing against the Jewish people today.
There's no way to explain something so irrational, so contrary to reality, than the force of simply demonic impact on the human mind.
In Psalm 87, verse 2, it says, the Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwelling places of Jacob. In the Psalms it says, beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. God gave me a vertical view. It's Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 16. Would you come up and read that, starting at verse 12?
How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High.
Satan wants to establish his throne where? Upon the mountain of the congregation on the sides of the north. When you're the enemy of the great God, you want to take away all of his property, and you want it to be yours. One of Satan's I wills of what I want to ascend to do is he wants to sit on his throne in the congregation of the north, on the north side of the mountain. Where are we? On the north side of Mount Zion. When you understand the spiritual applications of Satan wanting to assume the land that belongs to God, and not only the land, but the most preferred part of the land, then you begin to understand that different people who align with different things want to vie for the same land. And here you have the sons and the daughters of the Most High God pursuing this place. And you have the children of the world vying against them to take it away.
We see that God himself has brought the Jewish people back to the land, that Satan himself wants to wipe them out. So by standing with Israel, we stand with God and against the devil. And finally, by standing with Israel, if Israel does wrong, as a friend, we can correct Israel.
Yeah, we hope that you have come away with this realizing that actually this is far more complex than any of us maybe even realized before. That actually there are people here that we have to have love and a compassion for, caught in all sides of this conflict. That we have to be able to stand for truth and not just get swept up by what the media tell us.
I came here solely focusing on the political aspect of it, and what I didn't expect was to connect with the land and the people. In Palestine, you have a people who has their freedom taken away in their eyes from an enemy. So of course they're going to be frustrated, and of course out of that frustration they're going to have violence, especially when there's propaganda built up against the enemy. But on the other hand, you have the Israelis, and they have the right to protect themselves. But that causes a dilemma as well, because when they protect themselves with walls and fences and all these things against the Palestinians, their frustration builds, and then they need to protect themselves even more. And then to make everything worse, you have the media, which only shows one side of the story, which is mostly the Palestinian side. You can be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Israeli, and you can be pro-Israeli without being anti-Palestinian. Because at the end of the day, both people groups are just people, and they deserve peace.
I saw Israelis just wanting a place to call home. I saw Palestinians wanting a land to live in. I saw Israelis traumatized, and I saw Palestinians apparently unable to help themselves. So why does the media not say that? It's probably anti-Semitism, because it's unreasonable rejection of a people group. I come from a nation where that kind of a thinking, what would happen if I stand up, destroyed us 70 years ago. It destroyed us. And we can't afford to have that kind of thinking anymore. We can't afford to not stand up for what is right. But still, we turn into a worst enemy ourselves by just being silent, or by trying to appease the other side by saying what they want to hear, by saying, oh, it's all right, it's Israel's fault. That's wrong. I have a hope for my generation because I believe that the only limit that we truly have is our fear. And if we try to overcome that, if we start to stand up, we get to paint the future in a different light.
The media will say that Israel attacks Palestine again, and Israel is simply retaliating. The kind of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel messages that I'm seeing in social media today reminded me of my experience in Yad Vashem, or the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. What was really striking to me was how subtle the anti-Semitism was. Unfortunately, since I can see that in our media today, I do also realize that there is hope, because when you are here in Israel, you realize how wrong and how false those stories are. It's something that I hope everyone at some point in their lives, they get to be here on the ground seeing the truth.
I came here learning that the Jewish people are a hated group. I heard a lot of different things like Israel kills 3 Arab children. While we were here, there was an attack of someone. They were stabbed in their bed. There was an Arab stabbed a Jewish girl. And they said in the media that suspected terrorist kills Jewish daughter. And it really wasn't. It was actual terrorists. Even the mother of the son that did that killed the little girl, the mother said he's a hero. And it just really hurts me to see that, and we still see people that are just that evil.
The Israelis actually live life to the fullest. They live knowing that at any time they could be attacked by the other side. But at the same time, I've also seen how there's a diversity of Muslims, Arabs, all divisions that you can think of, and that there are places in Israel where people are living together as a diversity. I have noticed that there is demonization of the Jewish people, portraying them as an evil force towards the world. I think the rest of the world should see Israel just like any other country. The people are very inviting and they're welcoming, and I just feel that they are people as well, they're humans as well, and they should be treated fairly.
All the Japanese think that Israel is a really dangerous place, and I thought I was gonna die. As you see on nets, the news, that you see the kind of conflicts that's going on in this place. But I learned about the background of the story and how anti-Semitism. I was so surprised how many Jews were killed. God created everybody for a purpose, and to be gone just made me so angry, because God has a perfect plan, an amazing plan for their lives. My heart started to cry out for this nation, and it was an amazing experience.
As a black person, there can be racist things that have been towards me. Like a few days ago, I was called the N-word. So I understand what they're feeling when it comes to anti-Semitism. And you grow an immunity. I saw graffiti on the wall, basically saying that the Jews built this and America is sick for it, for helping them. It was a new experience because I've never been out of country, but I think it left a good impression on me. I felt more safe, I feel like I can really live here.
The idea of being pro-Palestinian was a big no in my head, because that meant I supported the activities that the radical people within that community did. But when I got the opportunity to go to that community and speak to people, I got to see that they were suffering a lot because of the radical people within their community. And it made me realize even more how much respect I have for Israel. I hope that my generation, which is so good at seeing groups of people who have injustice done upon them, can see that the anti-Semitism that's happening in the world, that is injustice upon the people here.
We learned a lot about the conflict here. And the media just shows us what is like, it's like a puzzle. They just show us one piece that appears to be the most impactful, the most shocking. But it's more than that. It's not just one piece, it's the whole picture, the whole puzzle. We talk to the Palestinians, but we also talk to the Israelis. I believe is the biggest reason for anti-Semitism. That is lack of knowledge. And being here is just really hard because we cannot get into a solution. And the only thing I gotta say to my generation is pray for peace in Israel.
Back at home when I was doing my surveys to come here, I went around asking people questions. I've had people say to me, why are you going to an apartheid state? Or they're racist against the Muslims and bits like that. Being here, I haven't seen any sign of apartheid. Apartheid is the separation of two people. But Arabs are a major part of the Israeli government. That's not apartheid. Apartheid, Arabs would not be in the government. They wouldn't be in the Israeli government. On the Palestinian side, Israelis can't even go into the territory. How can they have a part to play in the government? So which side is it that's apartheid? Just because someone's pro-Israel doesn't mean they're anti-Palestinian. Just because they're pro-Palestinian doesn't mean they're anti-Israel. I think that the people of my country that are anti-Semitic and anti-Zionists, they haven't been to Israel. They haven't experienced Israel. They're taking what the media shows and what other people's opinions are, and they're taking it on as their own. You need to come to see first to form your own opinions.
We have studied the history, we've spoken about the current affairs, we've met the locals and leaders, but the picture I got does not correspond to the one that is shown in the Western media. And tragically, the mainstream media forms the opinion of the masses. And for me, a line to anti-Semitism is crossed from legitimate criticism of an imperfect state, and Israel is imperfect, to when Israel is singled out for bashing when they are denied basic security rights. And for me as a German, it is specifically painful. The greatest enemy of anti-Semitism is the truth.
So you followed their journey, and you've just heard these stunning comments at the end as they have concluded their time in Israel. And we hope that you too have had a journey, that you have reconsidered some things or even had some things that you've thought about for the first time as we look at the complexities of this region.